All right, welcome back everybody. Thank you very much for coming. So our next speaker for this session is Nina Zakharenko with her talk, Goodbye Print Statements, Hello Debugger. Let's make her welcome. Thank you.
Hello, PyCon Australia. Good morning. My name is Nina. Show of hands, totally no judgment zone here. When you run into a bug in your code that needs investigating, how many of you use print to debug your code? Oh, wow. OK, the majority of you. You're in the right place. How many of you use PDB or IPDB for command line debugging? OK, maybe about 10%. And then how many of you use the debugger in your IDE? OK, maybe about 20%. Today I'm going to talk to you about the benefits of using debuggers when programming in Python. And I'm going to show you a few different types. And hopefully you're all going to learn something new in this talk. The slides are going to be available afterwards. There are plenty of additional resources throughout. Just download them to follow the links. And they're going to be available at nina.2/au19. And that link is present throughout the slides, so don't feel the need to jot it down right away. So a little bit about me. I work at Microsoft as a Python cloud developer advocate, where I focus on making VS Code and Azure easier to use for Python developers everywhere. That's the cute mascot for our team, Bit. If you think Bit is cute, please find me out in the hallway afterwards for a sticker. And I might even have some contraband Clippy stickers to share. I've written software for over a decade at companies like Meetup, Reddit, and HBO, and I've worked on projects big and small in a wide variety of organizations. I think it would be fun to try something during this talk. If you're learning something new, go ahead and share a tweet. You can use the hashtag PyConAU, and if you'd like to tag me on Twitter, at NNJA, it's like ninja without the I. Now, what are you going to learn today? I'm going to talk about why you should use debuggers. I'm going to cover breakpoints and other debugger fundamentals. I'm going to talk about my workflow, some tools, PDB, IPDB, IDEs, the new breakpoint method in Python 3.7. And then I'm going to cover some demos, tips, and tricks, and some guidance on when to use what. But a quick disclaimer that this is my way. There are many tools and workflows available for debugging. I'm going to show you the workflow that I use. That doesn't mean it's going to be the right one for you, so choose what works best for your situation. Now, if you're already using prints, you might be wondering, what's the point of using debuggers at all? The problem with print is print doesn't really give you a lot of context. If you've put prints in your code, you're probably pretty familiar with the process of tweaking what you're printing out because you got it wrong and then adding something else, or I'm sorry about that. OK. Hopefully that should be a little bit better. You might add something else and then rerun your code and then tweak your formatting and run it again, and it's a little bit tedious, right? So I'm going to show you a little demo application. And it kind of looks like this. It's a little bit of a Flask app, and yes, one moment. No problem. How's that? Can everyone hear me? Is that better? OK, great. My favorite cheesy joke is that if technology worked like we expected it to, we would all be out of a job. Yeah. So here we have just a little Flask application. It hits the GitHub search API for a handful of languages, and it lists some popular ones by stars. And the API data here comes back as JSON. Pretty standard stuff, something that the majority of us have probably had to do. And the meat of the code here is we're going to call an API in this repos with most stars method, and we're going to get some JSON back from the API. So how would we debug an issue with this with print? Because working with JSON can be kind of annoying, right? Sometimes data doesn't show up how you expect it to. Other times there are large nested data structures. And so you might go into your code here and go into this method, and we get some items back, and maybe I'm just going to throw a print in there. And if we go back and we run that code, and then I'm just going to click on that link to visit our website, and I'm going to get my print back, and this sucks. And so then you go through the iterations of figuring out what keys you want and modifying things, and tedious. So here's where Debugger can help, because with a debugger, you're using a tool made for the job. A debugger is going to drop you into the point of execution, allowing you not just to see the string representation of what you're trying to examine, but it's going to actually allow you to call it, to examine the arguments to a given function, to examine other values and variables in the scope, and a lot more. A debugger lets you examine the state of a running program. You can even write new snippets of code, change values, experiment to your heart's content here. A lot of folks starting out in Python, or even experts, I've met, senior architects and developers who still use print statements or prints because that's what they're used to. It just seems like there's too much overhead, too much stuff to learn. Using print is so familiar, but I really want to show you that there's nothing to be afraid of. You can get started with debuggers in no time at all, and it's really going to supercharge how you write your code and how you find bugs. And you're not going to have to clean up print statements littered all over your code when you're trying to examine the state of multiple objects. Once I gave up using print to debug, my productivity as a programmer really increased, and yours can too. So let's take a look at what debugging might look like. Going back to our code here, I'm just going to take this out. And notice that this is Python 3.7. And in Python 3.7, there's a new breakpoint method right there. And by default, with nothing set, it's going to drop you into the PDB debugger. PDB is included in the standard library. So going back to our terminal, let's run that. And I'm just going to click on that link there. And we'll see now there's an arrow here. So this tells me where in the execution flow I am. And now I'm here. I see a PDB prompt. That means I've hit my breakpoint, and I can start debugging. So there are a few useful methods that you can do here. I can do list. That's going to show me exactly where in the code I am. I can examine the variables in my workspace, so I can find out the length of the items. Let's say I want to just play around and get the very first item. I can easily do that and just pull it out, or even grab a slice, get the type of that item. It's a dictionary. I can even interact, and that's going to drop me into Python REPL that has all of the same variables available. So to exit the interactive console, I would hit Control-D once, and then to exit debugging, I can either do Q or Control-D to exit, but in this case, I'm going to type continue and let my program finish running. A little bit better, right? It's going to save you some time. But wait, there's more. Because at the end of the day, finding and fixing bugs, it's a process of confirming one by one that the things that you believe to be true about the code are actually true. And when you find an assumption that isn't, you found a clue. There's a few types of debuggers that we can use. Command line ones, PDB is included in the standard library. It's a great option. It's portable. You don't need to install anything else at all. I tend to use IPDB. It has nice IPython-like features like syntax highlighting, better tab completion, and that's what I'm going to be showing you in my demos today. You can get IPDB via pip install IPDB, and there are a lot more options in this category. So using IPython command line debugging might look something like this. And if you're not comfortable on the command line, or you prefer graphical tools, or you already use an IDE, there are plenty of options there available as well. PUDB is kind of a mix of both. It's a kind of a graphical CLI. Then there are IDEs. I use Visual Studio Code for my daily editor, so that's what I'm going to be showing you in my demos. PyCharm also has a great debugger, and many others. And so a IDE debugger might look something like this. The foundation of either of these methods of debugging is the breakpoint. A breakpoint is like a trap. So you're just kind of, walking along and you trip on something. It's your breakpoint. It's going to stop the flow of execution in your program. Like I said, in Python 3.7, you can use breakpoint. It's really nice. A really great reason for upgrading, because there are quite a few advantages. You can set your debugger of choice via an environment variable. So I prefer IPDB now, but I might want to use something else later. And by setting the breakpoint environment variable to how you would set a breakpoint in your tool, I can easily switch it out later in the future. Another advantage with breakpoint is that there is an environment variable that you can set a flag that will allow you to skip any breakpoints in execution. I'm going to talk about why that's important a little bit later on. Okay, if you're not running Python 3.7, there are other ways to set breakpoints for CLI debugging. You can add them directly to your code. For PDB, it's just PDB, import PDB and then pdb.setTrace for IPDB. Just add an I to both places. Or the second way is you can set them interactively. So you can run a PDB as a module with that -m flag. And then you can just type in where you want your breakpoints to be. Know that with option number 1, this is a little bit harder to disable. And with option number 2, if your code moves around, your breakpoint line numbers might change, right? So I prefer using number 1, the first approach exclusively, but to each your own. And they're just really kind of a handful of debugger fundamentals. There's 5 really important commands. And you can learn more about your tooling as you use it and figure out what you need. But there's only a handful of things you need to be productive. The first is L for list, or LL for long list. That's going to print out the code around the breakpoint that was hit. N is going to go to the next line. S is step into. So if there's a method being called, it's going to jump into that method. Otherwise, it's just going to go to the next line. C is going to continue until the next breakpoint or the program completes. And then most importantly, H for help with an optional command. If you forget what any of these do, you can just bring up helpful help menu. And there are lots of other really useful commands like R for return. That jumps to the return for the current function in execution, which could be useful if you have multiple return statements. Or J will let you jump to a line, and that will help you break out of a loop. But start with the basic commands, add things in as you need them. There's going to be a link to download this cheat sheet on my website. And yes, my cheat sheets do match my hair. Okay, so let's see a little bit more of debugging in the CLI. Okay, coming back here. The first thing I'm going to want to do is set my Python breakpoint to PDB. And there we go. So now IPDB is going to be my debugger. And I'm going to move my breakpoint here further up in this method to just above where I'm creating my query. And I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to run Flask, and I'm just gonna, instead of having to open up the browser, I'm just gonna curl, which will hit my web server and kick off my debugger. Okay, so one second here. It looks like my Python breakpoint is not set. What's going on here?
Did you export the variable?
Aha, thank you. Debugging with a room full of people. All right, thank you. Let's run that. And curl that. And there we go. There's my nice syntax highlighting, and you'll see tab complete and all of that. So now I have a method here where I'm creating the query. I can enter S. Remember, S stands for step. And that's going to bring me into the create query method. If I hit L for list, it's going to kind of show me where I am in the code. This looks a little bit better if your terminal font size isn't bumped all the way up. I can do A for args. That's going to tell me what arguments the method was called with. And then N is going to continue on to the next line. And just like with the interpreter, something you might bump into, and I still do, is I'm on line 19. But my query variable hasn't actually been defined yet. So I just need to hit next to go to the next line, and then I can see what my query looks like. Hitting R will bring me to the return, and now I can see my fully assembled query. So these are the languages that I had selected, and this is the minimum number of stars for the projects that I want to see. If I hit N again, that's now going to pop me up one level in the stack, back to the repos with most stars method that called that create query method. And then I can kind of go ahead and hit next to just continue on. There are a few other really helpful shortcuts. One is P for print and then double P for pretty print. So if I wanted to pretty print the keys available in my items dictionary. Oops. Let's just print that out. If I wanted to just print those out. This has no option keys. Oh, right, I'm sorry. What I wanted to be doing is looking at the very first item. Okay, here we go. So that's a pretty print of all the keys that this JSON dictionary has. I'm going to save that to a handy variable here. Another nice thing about tab complete here is if I hit tab right now, yeah, IPDB gives me some pretty helpful suggestions there. And I want to make sure to close that out. And there we go. So, I mean, huge time-saving tool for me. And I'm going to continue that and quit it out. Okay. What about debugging in IDEs? Since I like VS Code, that's what I'm going to use for my daily editor. So I'm going to be showing its debug capabilities here. There's just a few setup steps. You need to download VS Code. VS Code comes pretty bare bones, and the power there is with customizations. And you're going to need to install the Python extension for the best experience. And then you're also going to need to create a debugger configuration. It looks something like this. And visual breakpoints are going to come up as you're debugging, but they really just map to the same concepts we talked about. The play arrow is continue. The arrow that's kind of jumping over, well, that's next. The down arrow is step. The up arrow is up, and then green reset and red stop button. So let's look at debugging in VS Code. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. When you want to debug in an IDE, what you're likely to do is you're going to click on the left side of the line number. That's called the gutter. And that's going to set this red dot breakpoint. Let me just scroll up so everyone can see that. It's right there. And then in VS Code, you're going to click on this icon here, very helpfully, no bugs, right? It's like the best icon. And this is going to bring you up to the debugger window. If you're just setting up for the first time, you might not see anything in this dropdown. So you want to make sure to add a configuration. There'll be some helpful defaults here. I'm going to select Flask because that's what my app is. And then I'm going to hit play here. And you'll see that VS Code has changed. The bar on the bottom is now orange instead of blue. And that's letting me know that there's an interactive debugger session. So I'm just going to click on that. And now I have a yellow arrow telling me where my breakpoint was triggered, where I am in the point of execution. And one of the really nice things about this graphical debugger is I can mouse over these variables, and my stuff is right there, right? So it's kind of a lot less typing. If I want, I can use these buttons, or I can also hover over them, and it's going to tell me what the keyboard shortcut is to activate them. There's also something called a watch here. So these are variables that I just really kind of want to keep track of, and I can add them in this little window, and they'll always be available. There's a debug console as well. So it'll be kind of down here at the bottom. You just have to go to your debug console, and there's a really nice interactive debug console with like autocomplete and everything available as well. And then here on the bottom, you can select which breakpoints you want to activate. So I'm going to disable this one for now, and I'm going to re-enable my breakpoint in index.html. And index.html is a template. So if I go ahead and hit play, I'm going to see that my template, let me hide all of that. My template breakpoint was hit, right? And so now I can mouse over and see what all of these variables are set to, which is really, really nice for those of you who have written templates. Okay, so there are a lot of options. When do you use what tool? Like I said, I rarely use PDB from the standard library. I find the functionality a little bit limited, but it's really good to know about if you're working on a machine where you can't install additional dependencies, for example. My personal preference, for most small programs and scripts, I use IPDB. Sometimes I just want to work from the command line. That's where I'm most productive. I tend to reach for IDE debugging when my objects get complex, or my code base gets really large, or I need to dive in and debug templates. But choose the strategy that works best for you. Now, a few tips and tricks I wanted to share with you. A really simple one. This one took me a really long time to figure out. I've wasted a lot of time in my coding career just pressing N for next, or pressing enter to rerun the next command. But if your debugger is stuck in a loop, maybe you're looping over a really large collection, you can use J to jump to a line outside of it on the CLI, or in a graphical debugger, just set the next breakpoint and continue onwards. For those of you who went to Melanie Crutchfield's talk yesterday, you know how important tests are. So if you ever get stuck figuring out why a test is failing, throw a breakpoint in that unit test. I do that all the time. It's so handy. This is one of my favorite hacks. I showed you that you can enter interact to enter just a Python REPL from your debugger, but you can set up a PDBRC configuration file, and there's a link to download mine at the bottom. And I've set up an alias called interacti that instead of dumping me into the Python REPL is going to dump me into an IPython REPL. And I Okay, I'll demo that for like 3 seconds because I think it's really cool. So going back into my code, I'm just going to set a breakpoint here again. And let's run that here. And let's hit that. OK, so I showed you interact, right? This is just kind of built in. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I hit Control-C instead of Control-D. Let's do that. OK, so with my new alias interact I can enter an IPython REPL, which is fantastic, right? I can see all the same variables here. But I'm not going to talk about IPython too much, but there's a really useful thing here called cpaste that will let you paste in multi-line methods with no problem at all. So that one's a super nice trick. And you just have to do Control-D to exit IPython, Control-D to exit IPDB. And as a bonus, in the latest release of VS Code, it's officially going to be released in August, but I'm going to show you a little preview now. There's Jupyter Notebook debugging, which for those of you who do Jupyter Notebooks, I think you might really appreciate this. Keep an eye out for the announcement, aka.ms/pyblog. But once you have that latest update, if you go to a notebook, you should just see debug cell here. And that's going to kick off the debugger and let you do line-by-line debugging in this Jupyter Notebook, including with these like really nice like hover actions. So definitely check that out. And if you gotchas here, you don't want to leave your breakpoints in production code. It could halt your entire running program. You don't want to be responsible for that. If you use Python 3.7 and breakpoint, you can use an environment variable to prevent that. But it's really still best practice to not commit code with breakpoints in it. So a tip here is to use git precommit hooks. You can prevent commits that match conditions. I use pre-commit.com. There's a lot of built-in ones. It's written in Python. You can just pip install pre-commit. And there's a debug dash statements hook, checks for PDP, IPDB, breakpoint, and all the rest. And it's kind of smart. It uses the AST. It doesn't just check for those keywords in a file. And it's going to be a lot easier to future-proof as Python, the language, grows and new debuggers become available. And you can set up other pre-commit hooks, for example, to run a linter, to check for trailing white space, unused imports, et cetera. OK, so by now, you should have a basic understanding of how debugging works in Python, as well as the tools available from PDB and the standard library to graphical debugging and IDEs. And using a debugger for your own code base is really going to supercharge your productivity for fun, school, or work. And I hope I've given you the confidence today to say goodbye to print and hello to the debugger. A few additional resources are in the slides, a nice interactive tutorial. I believe Anthony Shaw wrote this great article, Python 3.7's new built-in breakpoint, and a quick shout out to Thea Flowers, who wrote the code that I used for caching the results of my API calls offline. Thank you so much. Please download the slides, nina.2/AU19. Follow me on Twitter at NNJA. And if you'd like to check out what Microsoft is doing with Python, visit aka.ms/AU19py. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nina. So we have this mug as a gift for our speakers, token of appreciation.
Thanks so much.
And if you'd like to talk more with Nina about debugging, you can catch her in the hallways or maybe at lunch. Now we have a 10-minute break before the next speaker.
Yeah, and if you'd like a sticker, find me in the hallway.